shocking brutality of the Myanmar military's violence towards Rohingya civilians.
That Bangladesh is often seen as the Western gate of Islamization too.
British decision to remove the monarchy from Myanmar.
We have a border counterpart which is not controlled by state. It is controlled by a non-state actor.
The Arakan army is much better at its public relations than the Myanmar military is.
The ethnic relationship between the Rohingyas and the Buddhists. And this is, and as well as the relationship with the Burmars and the Rohingyas have always been quite complicated over the past century.
That's a recipe for long-term conflict in Myanmar. What sort of country the Burma want Myanmar to be?
Welcome to my show, hosted by Alap. This is a platform where we discuss multiple issues ranging from international relations to strategic affairs to defense and, of course, economy. And we see the world from a very different prism than what we discuss about our relationship with different countries, different entities, different actors. Today, we will be discussing on an issue which is very, very important for Bangladesh and perhaps for the region as a whole, because this is an issue which has the humanitarian dimension, security dimension, and most importantly, a geopolitical dimension, given what is happening across the world, starting from Ukraine to Iran, to Israel, to Palestine. And then perhaps this is one issue that will remain as a constant factor in South Asian and Southeast Asian regional politics. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you look at the history, there is a particular cruelty to being rendered invisible twice. First, by the state that drives you out. The second is then the world watches and looks away. And the Rohingya case is that this has endured both. And for anyone who wants to and understand how that invisibility was engineered, not accidentally for sure, but deliberately, systematically over decades, there is now one book that does it better than any other. The book's title, Myanmar's Rohingya Genocide, Identity, History, and Hate Speech, published by Bloomsbury in 2021, was banned almost immediately in Myanmar, which, as peer reviews and my reading shows, that everything that you need to know about Myanmar and these humanitarian crises is very much there. And you would know about how close to the bone it cuts. The title is precise for a reason. 3 words: the identity, history, and hate speech. My guest's central argument is that what happened to the Rohingya was not a spontaneous eruption of communal violence, nor simply a military operation that went too far. Rather, it was a genocide constructed over time through the deliberate erasure of Rohingya identity, the systematic falsification of their historical presence in Rakhine, and the weaponization of hate speech to dehumanize an entire people before the killing began. The 2017 military clearance operations, the mass killings, the sexual violence, the razing of hundreds of villages were not beginning of the story, they were the culmination of it. 8 years on, over 1 million Rohingya remain in the world's largest refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. That means what we have now is a stateless population, aid-starved, and they're now caught between a newly armed contest between the Arakan army and the battle soldiers of Tatmadaw. The NUG is politically adrift. The International Court of Justice case grinds on, and donor funding has collapsed to its lowest level since the crisis began. My guest today has spent years in these camps, interviewing, listening, bearing witness, amplifying voices that the world has spent decades trying to silence. He was awarded the Early Career Emerging Scholar Prize by the International Association of Genocide Scholars, has lectured at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, Georgetown University, and the School of Oriental and African Studies, and he brings the conversation or perhaps the knowledge that is very rare in the refugee discourse in South and Southeast Asia, the rigor of a scholar, the instinct of a former politician, and the moral clarity of someone who has sat across from survivors and asked them what that cruelty, what they actually want. From Loughborough University, London, we now have Dr. Ronan Lee with us. Ronan, welcome to my show.
Great to be with you.
Thank you. Can you tell us something about your book, please?
Yeah, well, I've got a copy right with me. So the book is has been published some years now. So the book's focus is on, as you said, three things. It's about Rohingya identity, about the history of the Rohingya and of the crisis, and about hate speech in Myanmar. I mean, my view, and I think the historical record will show this. What we saw occur in 2017, the shocking brutality of the Myanmar military's violence towards Rohingya civilians, was the culmination of not just months or years, but the culmination of decades of genocidal violence against the Rohingya community. That was at times violent, so at times so violent that hundreds of thousands of Rohingya would flee Myanmar, and in certain waves throughout the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, we see hundreds of thousands of Rohingya flee across the frontier into Bangladesh. Some repatriate, some do not, some go to other places. We also see in Myanmar over decades very tight restrictions on access to basic human rights. So access to healthcare, access to education, very tightly restricted in Myanmar from the 1960s and the 1970s onwards, and restrictions on travel. So Rohingya locked down in their villages or their urban communities, unable to travel from one community to another. And this was not something that happened in just 2016 or 2017. This was something that had been going on for decades. So I think what we're talking about now is the culmination of decades of crisis for the Rohingya. So from the Rohingya's point of view, what occurred to them when they were forcibly deported from Myanmar in 2017 was the culmination of decades of abuse. For other people, so for what we often call the international community, the international media, and the senior figures in the UN and in foreign governments outside of the region, what we saw in 2017 was often very new to them. It was often the very first time they'd really heard about the Rohingya's situation. So for them, for those looking into the region from outside, this was a new crisis. And rather than looking at what underpinned it, the decades of abuse to the Rohingya, they looked at the proximate causes. I mean, this is something that we see happen. We see happen time and time again around the world when there's an international crisis. International media are often, and humanitarian assistance is very quick sometimes to arrive. But in terms of where politicians are getting their information, it's often from international media, and international media contextualize things with one paragraph in a newspaper article or two paragraphs in a newspaper article. And I think what we saw in 2017 was that often they missed the decades of abuse that the Rohingya had endured. And it is those decades of abuse that mean that the crisis is protracted. And that's why it's so difficult to talk about repatriation, because it's not simply a matter of removing the authority of the Myanmar military and to deport Rohingya. It's the policies that underpinned their actions in 2017 that are the problem. There was no mainstream political opposition to the Myanmar military's deportation of Rohingya within Myanmar. There was,
Absolutely.
whether it was government or opposition, there was no one in the mainstream of Myanmar politics. Now, there was some on the fringe. I think it's really important to acknowledge there were some on the fringes of Myanmar politics who were very brave and who did speak up. But they were by a long way the minority. And I think we should acknowledge their bravery, because it would have been a very difficult circumstance, particularly young people, particularly in Yangon, that I'm aware of in 2017, that were talking about how this was a real problem. But they were the minority. The mainstream of Myanmar politics, just across the board in Myanmar, it was everyone really, were supportive of what the Tatmadaw was doing, the Myanmar military were doing to the Rohingya in 2017, and that includes the then state councillor, the de facto prime minister, Aung San Suu Kyi. She's now been jailed by the military. She's in one of their jails post the 2021 coup. But when she was in political power, and in 2017 she was both the state councillor and the foreign minister, and she defended the actions of the Myanmar military. It shows you how deeply embedded the attitudes, the anti-Rohingya attitudes, were in Myanmar at that time. And I think if we want to dig deeper into that, I think we would need to look at what sort of state, what sort of country the majority of Myanmar want their country to be. And I think what 2017 showed us was that for the majority of people within Myanmar, for the Buddhist majority, what they regarded the country to be was that they felt that it should rightly be a Buddhist majority country and a culturally Buddhist country. And the Rohingya, as a Muslim minority in Myanmar, that they undercut that desire to make Myanmar a Buddhist country. My concern, of course, is that there's the Rohingya, of course, are a Muslim minority within Myanmar, but there are other religious and ethnic minorities in Myanmar. Yes, Buddhism represents more than 85% of the religion of the people within the country, but that leaves 15% of the country who are not Buddhist. And my fear is that once ideologically, once they have removed minorities like the Rohingya, then they'll start removing others too. And I think that's the real risk in Myanmar today, is that in the future, once one minority is removed, they'll move on to the next. And it's those dynamics that underpin much of the conflict of the civil war within Myanmar today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fascinating, because I think one of the concerns that we always raise is the Buddhist ethno-nationalism as one of the primary drivers, of course, that when it comes to the ethnic relationship between the Rohingyas and the Buddhists. And as well as the relationship with the Burmars and the Rohingyas have always been quite complicated over the past century. Now here, one thing is very important from your book. I'm going back to your book for a second, where you have actually showed that the genocide, I mean, you used the term genocide, which was a slow motion construction built through decades of identity erasure. And of course, then it has the legal statelessness came up. Now, here's the main issue that we often get confused about. I mean, when you look at Burma, which was a British colonial project, and what you get to see in the 1982 citizenship law that striped the Rohingya of nationality, and which was a reflection of what we call the colonial era classifications of nationality. Now, This particular architecture, I mean, do you still consider that it was inherited from the imperial period, or perhaps the Burmese government or the Burmese always had a construction of identity that predates imperial time? And how does that history carry any moral weight for what the West does, or perhaps doesn't do, in the case of Myanmar today?
It's pretty clear that before the colonial period, before the British colonial period, uh, ideas around ethnicity, um, race, and religion were, I mean, I'd use the term sort of much more lightly held, that these were not seen in quite the same way that they're seen in Myanmar today. So something absolutely changed during the colonial period. So I think what changed was that the formal classification and a classification undertaken by the British that then determined various things for people in terms of livelihood opportunities, in terms of life opportunities within the colonial structure. So it gave advantages to certain identities and disadvantages to others. Some of those advantages were perceived advantages, and over time these become in a sense the reality, and some of the disadvantages then over time become the reality. And the independence movement within within Myanmar. Now, the independence movement, the pre World War II independence movement was not monocultural. There were very prominent Muslims within the independence movement, but it was dominated by Buddhists, and it was dominated by ethnic Burma, which is an overwhelmingly Buddhist group. Now, some of that traces its roots to the unhappiness among the Buddhist religious class within Myanmar during the colonial period. And I think this is something that sort of endures to the current day. I mean, the monkhood, the Sangha in Myanmar is incredibly political, in a way that I think is probably more political, I think, than you would see the monkhood in other Buddhist countries. And I think at root is the British decision to remove the monarchy from Myanmar, and with the removal of the monarchy, the removal of the primary patron of the monkhood. So overnight, with the country becoming a British colonial possession, the monarch is gone, the Burmese king is gone, but the king's social role was what was significant. And their social role was that they were someone that donated money to the monkhood. They supported the monkhood. So in a sense, they collected taxes from ordinary people, and then those taxes were sent back, a large portion, to the monkhood. The removal of the king creates a crisis for the Buddhist religion within Myanmar. And for many religious Buddhists, many monks, they began to see the crisis of their religion as a call to oppose British colonial rule. So into the anti-colonial movement, you get a very active political class of monks, and within the anti-colonial movement, you get this idea that it is a Buddhist duty to oppose the colonial, the British, to oppose British colonial rule, because that has damaged the monkhood. So when the country gains independence in 1948, we see a very different country to what we saw when the British first arrived. We see a country where questions of religion and ethnicity and race are very, very deeply held. That your religion or your ethnicity might, for instance, determine your job or your ability to access government privileges. And this was very different to how it had been prior to the colonial period, combined with at that point, a century-long anxiety about the damage to the Buddhist religion that had been done during the colonial period. And what we see during there's a period from 1948 until 1962 that's sort of a democratic period within independent Myanmar, where there were genuine elections, there were political parties being elected. At that point, immediately post independence, we see Rohingya serving in parliament, serving in senior government roles. They were part of the national political fabric at that point, but there was a real push within the politics of Myanmar in the 1950s for Buddhism to be the state religion, even though its special place it was acknowledged in the constitution, but it wasn't imposed as the state religion. But we see even in the 1950s among democratic politicians a very firm view among the majority that Buddhism must be central to the politics of the country and to the culture of the country. That gets turbocharged, that attitude gets turbocharged after a military coup in 1962. The Myanmar military comes to power, and they use religion to build themselves into power. They use religion to support what they're doing. They wanted legitimacy, and they use religion to build their legitimacy in power. Now, the feeling in the early 1960s was that the military might stay in power for some years and then hand authority back to a new democratic government. They didn't do that. They stayed in power from 1962, and they've never left. And so we're more than half a century on. They're still running the country, and they're still using religion as a key tool of legitimacy and of state building. So the Myanmar, the Burma that we saw in 1948 at independence was a country where there was not full agreement as to what would be part of the country. You had groups. The Karen community, for instance, had believed that they'd been promised their own independence by the British. Shan communities believed the same. So state building became a really important role for the Myanmar military after the 1962 coup, and they did that through religion.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely fascinating, Ronan. I think that brings me to one question. I think this is something that I personally have been quite confused about. Does it really mean then, I mean, as you have given the historical account, that the key to the solutions regarding the Rohingya crisis, particularly when you see it from the Buddhist point of view, or perhaps see it from Islamic point of view, and perhaps I get to hear often from my friends in Arakan, quite often they would tell me that Bangladesh is often seen as the western gate of Islamization too. And at the same time, Rakhine is surrounded by the mountains, and then the only route that they have or access to the world is water, which is Bay of Bengal. So which makes them to see the only land border that they have is with Bangladesh, which is often seen as a clear case for them. Is not only the Bengali identity or Bangladeshi identity, but also the import of the religion which has never been native to them. Now that brings us to this particular question: is it really then that ethno-nationalism, since this is going to be there, the key to this particular solution lies in greater communication and confidence building between the Buddhist monks, who, as you have mentioned, are the political monks rather, and the Muslim leadership within the Rohingya communities? Will that make any kind of change as such?
It will certainly help, but what is needed in Myanmar is for a very clear a discussion and an honest discussion about what sort of country the majority want Myanmar to be. The problem, as I see it, is that the majority, and it's a Buddhist majority, and it's an ethnic Burma majority. So some of these identities overlap. Of course, the Rakhine are not Burma; they're a different Buddhist group. But the majority within the current borders of Myanmar, the majority is the religious majority is Buddhist, and the ethnic majority is Burma. And the question is really what sort of country the Burma want Myanmar to be. Now, what it appears to be, what 2017 told us, was that the Burma majority want Myanmar to be a Buddhist country, and that's it. That they see the country as Buddhist, and that they will claim that others are welcome, but others are welcome so long as they integrate within Buddhism and that they behave in a way that the Buddhist religion accepts, so that they, in a sense, know their place, and their place is secondary, or would be regarded as secondary to the Burma Buddhist majority. Now, that's a recipe for long-term conflict in Myanmar. I mean, Myanmar's home to the world's longest-running civil war. It's basically a civil war that started at independence, and it's never stopped. And it's never stopped because what's needed is a political settlement. It's not about defeating one of the ethnic minority groups in battle, because their issues are not purely military. Their issues are political. They want a political settlement. They want, for instance, to be able to express their religious views and for that not to be treated as though it's treasonous. They want to be able to wear their national dress, to sing their national songs in a way that's regarded, and speak their language in a way that's regarded as not seditious or treasonous and worthy of punishment. And until the majority in Myanmar is prepared to accept that, then there will be conflict within the country. And at the pointy end of that, at the peak of that, is the conflict's probably the wrong term, but the crisis between the Burma majority exercised through the Myanmar military, its power, and that group which they regard as the least likely to integrate with Buddhism, which is the Rohingya community, the Muslim community in the west of the country.
Absolutely.
Because they regard them as fundamentally undercutting the national building project. So the Western Gate they talk of as the place where Islam comes into the Western Gate, basically the Naf River, as the place where Islam comes into Myanmar, but also where the British came into Myanmar. So it's in the political psyche of many of the political ideologues within Myanmar. The concept of the Western Gate is more than about who lives in Butidong or Mongdor. It's a political concept rather than just the pure fact of it's a border. I mean, Myanmar shares borders with lots of places, and the conflict is not the same. The issues are not the same in those places, and they don't talk about the border with Thailand. I mean, historically, Myanmar the Myanmar state, I think, has been to war with Thailand more than anyone else, more than any other state. But they don't talk about the border with Thailand in modern times in the same way that they talk about the Western Gate. So the issue is really about what sort of state the Myanmar majority want, what sort of country they want. Do they want a country where ethnic and religious and other minorities can be part of the country and can flourish as part of the national political fabric? Or do they want to be monocultural, mono-religious, and exclude all others? The challenge is that they want to be more. Well, the evidence says that what the Buddhist majority in Myanmar wants, the Burma Buddhist majority wants the country to be monocultural, mono-ethnic, mono-religious, but they want the benefits in terms of social stability, peace, and economic outcomes that come with being a multicultural society and being a society where you've integrated your minorities in a way that they feel they can that they can flourish, and that they don't need to take up arms because you've addressed their, I've got to say, very reasonable political concerns. I mean, the Rohingyas' political claims are pretty straightforward: basic access to human rights, an ability for their children to get an education, travel between their villages, work, but just be able to do normal work, be able to go to a hospital when needed, and be able to undertake religious practice without that being seen as a threat to the stability of the country. I mean, these are very reasonable things. I
I,
mean, these
I,
are things that many people would take for granted and would see that as very straightforward and simple. But while the majority in Myanmar doesn't value minorities being able to do that,
true.
then we're gonna have conflict.
I mean, this is where another issue comes in. I mean, in the greater political conversation in Myanmar, I mean, the inclusion of the minorities are largely defined within the spectrum of Buddhism, or they might have a different ethnic classification, but the general consensus is the Buddhist talking to Buddhist, means Burma talking to Buddhist ethnic groups. And this is where the main issue is: the inclusion, the exclusion. And exclusion of particular religion. As you have rightly mentioned, the Rohingyas were part of state building, statecraft back in time. But at the same time, you're now seeing that the complete erasure of the Rohingyas in any kind of political conversation, whether it is in Nopito or Yangon, or perhaps even if you go to Wa State or Karen, wherever you go. Now, this is where I think one fundamental problem comes in too. I mean, if I take the majority-minority relationship out, even if you look at Arakan Army's position on its political governance itself, are they looking for autonomy? Are they looking for confederation? Or even if you look at their relationship with their neighboring states, Shin and others, you still see that the ethnic armed groups or the ethnic political groups are still not able to come to some sort of consensus about what they actually wants from the Babar majority too. I mean, if you look at their perception of the state of Myanmar, is it going to be a confederation? Is it going to be just a union? Or perhaps forget the conversation of republic or anything, but perhaps some sort of coexistence. I mean, Wa State has its own ecosystem. Then you are now seeing a number of ceasefire has been agreed. You are now seeing that there is a greater conversation going on between Tatmadaw or Nopido with the different ethnic armed groups. Now, what does it mean? I mean, does it mean that it is not only the question of the perception of state of the Bamar population, is it also the problem of the groups, those are part of this conflict, that they haven't been able to form their own consensus about what kind of state they want to see?
Entirely right. I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, in many ways, the attitudes of the majority in Myanmar have been kind of replicated within political circles among the ethnic groups. So we see this in very clearly in Rakhine State with the Arakan Army, that the Arakan Army's political views are remarkably similar ideologically to the Myanmar military's political ideology. They're almost identical, but with one key point of difference. The Arakan Army regards its core constituency to be the ethnic Rakhine Buddhists, not the Burma Buddhists. That's
Correct.
the difference. Correct. I mean, I would say, by and large, to most scholars who would look at the situation in Myanmar from the outside and look in, they would see the Arakan Army's ideology and the Myanmar military's ideology as almost identical, but with one key difference, and that's who the group regards as its core constituency. And because there's a difference in terms of core constituency, that's where you see conflict between the Arakan army and the Myanmar military. But in terms of what sort of country the Arakan army would like to see, I think they're much closer in terms of their values to the Myanmar military than I think probably than they would admit. And that's because they're fighting the Myanmar military for exclusive control of territory within Rakhine State. The Myanmar military believes that they should be the people who control the force of arms within Rakhine State. The Arakan army believes it should be them. And the Arakan army's view is that once they control the state, they will be able to determine all of the policies within the state. I think ultimately, if the Arakan army believed that they could sustainably maintain independence and not be part of Myanmar, they would comfortably do that. I don't think they, from an ideological point of view, I don't think they would have any problem whatsoever with declaring Rakhine independence. The reality, though, and they're aware of this, is that that's not feasible. The state, in terms of its population and in terms of its infrastructure, is just not capable of doing that at the current time. So their compromise is that they will fight to control the state, and they will expect and they will hope that the national political control of the state is limited. So, for instance, they will collect the taxes in Rakhine. They will run the police force in Rakhine, and maybe they won't engage with foreign economic policy or issue passports, but the rest of the place will be determined by the Arakan army. That's their view. Now, the real worry here is that the Arakan army is much the same as the Myanmar military, is not a democratic institution. This is in some ways a reflection of Rakhine attitudes, but not democratic Rakhine attitudes. And it's very difficult for Rakhine to oppose the Arakan army's political views. So we have a situation where what's actually happening in Rakhine State is that an armed group that claims to represent the Rakhine Buddhist community is imposing political views on the majority of the Rakhine community, and is unwilling to have the kind of open debate about the future of Rakhine State and what sort of place it should be. They're refusing to have that debate in much the same way that the Myanmar majority and the Myanmar military don't want to have that debate for Myanmar as a whole. And that's creating now a problem. There's a conflict between the Myanmar military and the Arakan army, and the Myanmar military wants to exclude the Rohingya. The Arakan army, their views pretty much the same. Pretty much the same. They do not regard the Rohingya as a full part of the political fabric of the country.
Here, I just wanted to add to what you have said. I mean, the control prism, if you look at whether it is territorial control or the control over resources or control over economics, or perhaps whichever way this control comes in, is very much common between these two entities. I mean, Burmese authority wants to control Rakhine, Arakan army wants to control territory and therefore deliver services by themselves. And here is another common thing, which is the ideological convergence. I mean, to a great extent, I mean, they might have different ethnicity, but what glues them is the religion as such. So I think this is where they also converge. But here is another concern then, I mean, as you have mentioned, because whenever I would speak to Arakan counterparts, and I get the conversation, the narratives that Arakan Army has been under repression for many years. Even NLD, when it was in power, they designated them as the terrorist organization, which still remains as a valid legal provision in the Burmese legal system. And that's where they would always argue that we are under some sort of, constrained situation, war is going on, conflict is going on, we are under super stress, and we don't really have enough time to really go for democratic aspiration at the moment in terms of creating inclusion. But at the end of the day, they have also showed that they are now trying to include some Rohingyas into their state administration over the past few months. Now, this is where my question for you is: if you look at the Arakan Army, I mean, of course, there are criticism, but there are also opinions that they're becoming liberated or perhaps occupied for whenever the Rohingyas would come, or for us, when you see it from Dhaka's position, it's a negotiating partner, because for the first time since 1971, we have a border counterpart which is not controlled by state. It is controlled by non-state actor, which is Arakan Army. And Arakan Army now controls almost 80% of Rakhine state. Even what you have said has been echoed by the Amnesty International too, and to a great extent, ICG international reports have also highlighted number of forced labor, arbitrary detention, and to a great extent killings too. That too under the watch of earlier Tatmadaw and now under the Arakan Army. Now, even if you look at all these factors, I mean, what kind of future do you see for Arakan Army as Bangladesh's neighborly actor? Because here we have actually seen that when it comes to the repatriation conversation, I mean, earlier we had the obstacle coming from the military, and now that military has got an elected government, and perhaps that elected government will also be pursuing the similar position about the repatriation. And now we have the second actor, which is Arakan Army, which has shown some interest, but not an interest which can be considered as a credible, concrete, tangible interest. I mean, in that case, how do you see Arakan Army as an actor that can actually provide some sort of impetus or genuine interest in terms of Rohingya repatriation?
I think ideologically, the differences of opinion between the Myanmar military and the Arakan Army as regards the Rohingya are minor. Their views are very similar. So I think what you're likely to see, I mean, I will say this: the Arakan Army is much better at its public relations than the Myanmar military is. I mean, that's something that's been apparent for some years, that the Arakan Army is reasonably good at public relations and at its international messaging. But what it says internationally is not necessarily what it's saying on the ground in Rakhine State.
Sure.
So that's that will be an important point as part of any, would a Rohingya person feel safe in Rakhine State? Well, if you believe what's been said internationally by the Arakan Army, then you would assume they would feel safe. But if you were hearing what's been said on the ground in Rakhine State, you would probably come to the opposite view. Bangladesh unquestionably needs to be in communication with the Arakan Army for the simple reason that they're a military influence on the border, and that they are a fact. They exist and they're there, and they've got guns, they've got weapons, and it's important to ensure that the Myanmar crisis doesn't. The current Myanmar crisis, the civil war, doesn't spread across the border into Bangladesh. I mean, that will be an important security priority for Bangladesh's new government. But in terms of repatriation, it's not something that would happen quickly. So we've probably got to think about what is the situation likely to be in the coming years, not tomorrow or next month, but in the coming years. My strong sense is that what we're seeing within Myanmar is, yes, the Arakan army is embedding itself in terms of control in Rakhine State, but that's occurred in an environment where the Myanmar military is stretched across the country and is struggling nationwide. And what the Myanmar military has historically done, when it's stretched, it pulls back from one place and it resolves an issue in another place through deals, compromises, military engagement, whatever it needs to do. And once that's dealt with, it is likely to come back to Rakhine State. So I don't necessarily regard the situation on the ground today in Rakhine State as likely to be the situation on the ground in 2 or 3 years' time. We could well be dealing with a very weakened Arakan army in a year's time, or a strengthened one. That remains to be seen. So those factors will be ongoing. No repatriation would be possible during a conflict. So it's as simple as that. While the Arakan army is in live military conflict with the Myanmar military, you simply cannot repatriate civilians from a community where both the armed groups have indicated they don't regard the civilians as a legitimate part of the political fabric. That would be just inherently dangerous. Inherently dangerous, and risks the Rohingya civilians being used within the conflict in a way that would be very unhelpful for all parties and would just create more conflict, I believe.
Yeah, this is where two important issues would come up, Ronan. And I think when you talk about the stability, for an example, I mean, everybody wants Myanmar's stability. I mean, the Chinese want, the Indians want, Bangladeshis want, Thais want, ASEAN they want. But again, whose image is this stability? I mean, if you look at the energies,
China's image. That's the stability.
Okay.
That's the yards. I mean, there's no question that what will determine where the international community goes geopolitically and what it regards as acceptable stability. I mean, acceptable levels of instability, but it is China. China will determine that. If China regards Myanmar as its backyard, it wants a level of stability in Myanmar where Myanmar is not a threat to China's interests. So both in terms of its territory and its economics. And while that can occur, then China, a major player in the UN, permanent member of the UN Security Council, they're the regional behemoth. I mean, they are the regional major player. They share a very long land border with Myanmar. They are accessing oil and gas through Myanmar, which is significant. We're seeing issues currently about the dangers, the economic dangers of reliance upon choke points in supply chains around the Straits of Hormuz. China is concerned about the Straits of Malacca. China is concerned about the South China Sea. So access to oil and gas via Myanmar is important to China. And while those things occur, then China will regard Myanmar as acceptably stable. Now, it's not there yet. I think China's view is that Myanmar's not there yet. But you just need to look at the way China turns on and off the conflict tap in Myanmar. So when the Three Brotherhood Alliance took on the Myanmar military, it's over a year ago now, and took in fact controlled the land access to China between Mandalay and China. That was because China had given the go-ahead to the Three Brotherhood Alliance to do that, and had likely provided arms, but approval to do that. And that was because that the Chinese authorities were unhappy with the Myanmar junta's performance when it came to scam centers along the Chinese border.
True.
So China was unhappy that the Myanmar military hadn't shut down these centers. The Three Brotherhood Alliance said they would do so, and China gives that group permission to proceed, and they defeat the Myanmar military. And it was a major reversal for the Myanmar military. So while China's happy, I think that will determine the level of stability that we're going to see, a level of conflict that we're going to see within Myanmar. And I think it's important to remember, China doesn't want a strong Myanmar. That does not serve China's political interests. China wants some level of conflict and instability within Myanmar, because it weakens Myanmar, and that suits China. What China doesn't want is that conflict spilling into China or affecting its economic interests. So, the baseline measure for the future of Myanmar is not peace and love. The baseline measure is a level of conflict that is acceptable to China, and yeah.
That means, I mean, this is an ominous comparison. Apologies for that, but this is an ominous comparison that if you see what is happening in Iran, the weaker Iran is always good for many other countries too. I mean, and that is going to be the recipe of long-term regional instability. And the way you were mentioning about the Chinese position, yes, of course, then China has another argument. I mean, of course, the argument in a sense not to deny the fact that the weaker Myanmar is always of interest, not only for the Chinese, but also for the Indians and others too. But here, the main issue is that when you look this weaknesses, right? I mean, you also get to see that International Court of Justice, I mean, being there. I'm not advocating for that, but most certainly that remains as one of the key factors when it comes to Bangladesh's approach to Myanmar. Then you have the U.S. who has considered it as a genocidal action. Now you have the Burma Act over there enacted by the Americans. And then obviously you're now seeing that Washington is not as polished, if I may use the term, that you used to see back in time. So therefore, they also do have their interest, and their geopolitical interest in the Bay of Bengal is rising. And rightly, you have mentioned, even if you look at it from Malacca point of view, and Arakan certainly remains their blind spot. I mean, it is divided by mountains, and then, of course, Yunnan and others are there. So I think, what do you think? I mean, what would be the Western response? I mean, I may add a little footnote to this particular discussion. I mean, the West were the major source of humanitarian aid for the Rohingyas in Bangladesh, right? And, you know, last year, I mean, humanitarian response was funded at just 37% than what we had in 2017. So it is the lowest, and it's going to really crumble in the coming days. And if you see that the funding is crumbling, then you have the conflict dynamics, then you have the power play that is happening. And at the end of the day, I get to hear, at least from a lot of actors in Myanmar, that ICJ case is not in favor either of Arakan Army or Tatmadaw. So therefore, their position is International Court of Justice verdict will be very late. Then you have the Security Council and so on. All these institutional arrangements are in place, which can make things look promising, but at the same time gloomy. And this is where I wanted to know that what do you think that what would be the West response to this particular crisis in the coming years?
Well, the West's response will
Yes.
be that they will say all the right things as regards human rights and about concern and about international law, and then they'll do very little. I mean, that's been the West's approach to the crisis for decades, really. Yes, they put in 2017. There was definitely Western money, no question about that. But it's a very different The international aid infrastructure is very different today. The Trump administration has withdrawn huge sums of money from humanitarian causes. The destruction of USAID has been a big problem, and I think that there will be the culture of international donation is different today than it was even 10 years ago. I'm talking to you from London, and the political reality today is really different to even 5 years ago in the UK. There's much less willingness to be supportive of international causes than there was 5 or 10 years ago. So I think there's some worrying times ahead in terms of the financial support that's needed. And that's why I think it's a real problem that the Rohingya refugees have been made reliant on that financial support. I mean, a situation where there are restrictions in their ability to sort of run their own business and sort of do livelihood activities, I think is a real problem. And their restrictions within the camps are a problem, of course, because it means they can't easily take a job outside the camp. So that's something that long term will be a challenge for Bangladesh's new government. They will simply, I think, be confronted with the reality, which is that there isn't enough money, or there won't be enough money coming in from the West to fund, or from previous donor sources to fund the humanitarian relief that the Rohingya have relied upon. So the obvious solution would be, and I think we'll see this being pushed, will be for the Rohingya to be able to access other livelihood opportunities to be able to sustain themselves, and that's something that this new Bangladesh government will have to address. I think in terms of political engagement from the West, you'll get very little. Would be my sense. There was some. I mean, you talked about the United States making a genocide declaration about the Rohingyas' experience. The U.S. State Department published a very comprehensive report, very detailed and an accurate report that outlines why they came to that correctly, why they came to that conclusion. It's the correct conclusion. But that was during the Biden administration. There's a very different world now. I mean, the Trump administration's attitude towards Southeast Asia is very, very different to the Biden administration's. I mean, I dare say, I think President Trump would struggle to locate Rakhine State on a map. I mean, I'm not trying to be flippant, but just in terms of the things that he regards as his priorities, Rakhine State won't be one of them. And it's very clear he just doesn't have an interest in what's going on in Myanmar. He regards it as China's backyard, so you won't see US engagement in the way that you would have maybe under a Biden administration, or in the past we saw with Obama's engagement.
So my last question, we're almost at the fag end of our discussion, and thank you very much for that. This is fascinating. Now, this is a practical question to close. I mean, because your audience needs something to act on. I mean, a lot of questions that you might get in the coming days. I mean, what are the 2 or 3 things the international community must do differently, and more precisely, for Bangladesh, what does a realistic, dignified pathway forward actually look like, even if it's uncomfortable?
Look, this is all about political will. This is all about what people are prepared to do, and there's no good outcomes here. There's no magic bullet. There's no immediate solution that will solve all of these things. The number one thing is that I think has been missing in so much of this is actually respecting the Rohingya as human beings and regarding them as political beings. They're not just refugees who are victims. They are, in fact, humans like the rest of us, and they have a political life, and they should they should be given access to that political life. And that means actually hearing uncomfortable things from Rohingya, from ordinary Rohingya, giving them a way of expressing themselves so that ordinary Rohingya can express a political point of view. There's been a general avoidance of giving ordinary Rohingya a platform. There's been a fear that if you give ordinary Rohingya a platform, they'll organize events and rallies and things, and that will be, and they will demand things that are that various governments are unwilling to grant. But resolving this crisis fundamentally will require that to occur, because you will not be able to negotiate any sort of repatriation or long-term arrangements if ordinary Rohingya don't feel that they've had a genuine say in the political decision making that's gone on. So that would be the first thing. I would think that genuine political outlets, freedom of expression within the camps should be encouraged, not discouraged. And I understand that it's often the thing that we don't want to hear. We don't want to hear groups saying things that we may not like, but it's important that they do, because otherwise we won't be hearing what the government won't be hearing what the actual views are. Secondly, livelihood opportunities within the camps, I think, need to be addressed. We know that there will be less money coming in from donor countries. We can see that already, and just turning down the tap for the Rohingya and saying, oh well, there's less money coming in, so you'll have fewer rations, but we're not going to allow you to work or to undertake basic livelihood opportunities, build gardens and things like that. That will become an unsustainable position. So I think that's something the new Bangladesh government should look at urgently. I mean, urgently. I think livelihood opportunities for the Rohingya. And I think the third thing is that there needs to be a discussion between, and this is the geopolitics of it now, there needs to be a discussion between all parties about what they genuinely want for the future. Not what they're saying. I mean, I would recommend very clearly some sort of closed door discussions about this, where we can get a clearer sense. I mean, my strong sense is the Myanmar military, the Myanmar government now, in the junta, do not want Rohingya returning to Myanmar, and if they had their way, they'd expel the other 500,000 that are still in Rakhine State, or potentially kill them. I mean, that's my sense. I don't think the Myanmar military has any desire to have the Rohingya return to Myanmar. I think the worry is that the Arakan army probably don't want them back either. And if they do accept any of them back, it will be because they believe they need cheap labor, and they will not integrate them within the political fabric of Rakhine State, and that's an unsustainable position long term. So we've got to talk about seriously about where the Rohingya's future is. Now, this is the uncomfortable thing, and I'm not advocating this, but there is. I mean, you look at what happened in the aftermath of the Second World War, and that there were population swaps in many parts of the world, where groups in one place were moved to another, and vice versa, where the view of the countries involved, often sadly without the involvement of the actual people who have been moved, but the view was that long-term stability would be better served by some numbers of people moving in one direction or another direction. You look, particularly we saw this between Greece and Turkey. We saw a lot of this. Now, long term, those things have generations long impacts on the communities that move. But from the Rohingya's point of view today, if you're a child born in the refugee camp in Cox's Bazar district today, what does your future look like going forward? Well, at the moment, your future looks like you're gonna be born in a camp, you're gonna grow up in a camp, and you're gonna die in a camp, and that should shame us all. That should not be something that we accept as a reasonable outcome. And that's something that I just think we need to address. And it's going to require compromise often uncomfortable compromise by all parties.
I think this is where I think we need to wake up, Ronan, because I think the cost of this humanitarian catastrophe is way deeper than what we can perhaps perceive at the moment. Because you have rightly mentioned the children who are born. I mean, what are their future? I mean, how are they going to grow up? I mean, it's that's why I opened this discussion by saying that you become invisible twice, one by your own state, and then everybody leaves you, and they leave you under the watch of nobody. So this is where I think this is, if you interpret it from a human point of view, of course, there are philosophical understanding that everyone deserves to live with dignity. But on the other hand, if you see it from a state point of view, then certainly you become a security risk. And this is where I think we need to work together. International community must continue dialogues. Bangladesh needs to be much more open and candid about what you have said, creating space for the Rohingyas. At the same time, we need to really put pressure, and I don't know how this pressure will work out in the future, but most certainly there has to be a political will to make change when it comes to their approach, whether it is bomber ethnic groups or the military or NUG or Arakan Army, whichever entity is over there, regarding their perception about the Rohingyas. And I think that is very important. Otherwise, if it becomes a security concern, nobody will be immune to that. I mean, and if you look at, if you draw a circle from Cox's Bazar and span it within 80 kilometers, you're probably going to see at least 20 to 30 insurgent groups or ethnic armed groups or different kinds of political groups functioning, and which is not a very nice thing for international community too. But at the same time, there was another issue. Of course, oil and gas is very much there, and this is where I was wondering that whether West will at some point of time come and take a try to get a cut of that particular pie called oil and gas, and now you have the rare earth. With that note, thank you very much, Ronan, for your time, and I'm quite sure our audience has learned, and most importantly, they now have a better insight into the problem that was not created by Bangladesh. So therefore, I think while the problem will continue to be there, we have to find a pragmatic solution. And I think your guidance is highly appreciated, not only by us, but by the audience. Thank you very much, Ronan, for your time.
My pleasure.
Pleasure. With that note, audience, we conclude today's session, and you have listened to Dr. Ronan Lee. And Dr. Lee is an authority on this subject because he deeply studies it. He has a policy contribution. He has contributed to narratives, discourse, rhetorics, and I'm quite sure that his able expertise will make us better understand the crises linked with the Rohingyas, linked with other ethnic groups in Myanmar. And for us, it is very important to see that Myanmar stabilizes. Thank you very much.